Okay, so I want to talk about trauma just a little bit more. PTSD, complex PTSD. Okay, one of the pieces I want to re-emphasize would be the fact that trauma is inflammatory in nature. Somehow this often escapes us. We get inflammation on the mental, emotional, psychological spectrum, which of course makes sense, but also on the physical spectrum as well. PTSD, and I'm going to use the term PTSD and complex PTSD interchangeably in this video, because in this case they are very similar. But what we see would be it's holistic in nature, and if we're going to address the beast that is PTSD, we have to come at it from a holistic perspective. We have to address both the mental, emotional, psychological side of things, but also the physical side. If you do one without the other, or vice versa, addressing the physical side without addressing the mental, emotional, psychological side, then either doesn't really work. I think that's probably why just throwing drugs at PTSD doesn't help and often makes things worse, in my humble opinion. I was trained naturopathically to think holistically, but even still, I tend to want to, in my brain, separate things out. Maybe it's the culture, maybe it's just the way things work in my brain. But inflammation of everything. And so also the crossover piece, I mean, I've talked about it on the channel, the whole HPA axis and the vagus nerve being the venue whereby you get things that could be merely like emotional, psychological abuse can turn into physical illness, and certain physical conditions often have a connection to PTSD. I mean, we go both ways. For example, and there's crossover to such extent that in my office, sometimes when I see certain kinds of conditions, physical conditions, with reportedly no mental, emotional thing going on, I ask the question, where's the trauma? Where's the underlying unresolved PTSD? Because it's very certain kinds of conditions are strongly correlated. Not just my experience, but the experience of a lot of my colleagues, NDs I've spoken with, and others even beyond ND world. So that is strong, the connection between them, holistic, inflammation, etc. And I'll cover more of this in future videos. So keep that in mind. But the thing that's been the rock in my shoe for the past few years, really since I read Pete Walker's book, where he describes the 4 responses that he sees to trauma: fight or flight, freeze or fawn. This completely resonates with me in my experience, right? Fight or flight I learned about in medical school. Got that one down. Sympathetic, exactly. Got it. Freeze, I've observed in my office, and I get exactly where that is a response to trauma, to just freeze. Fawn, also, I mean, I'm in the helping profession. Many people in the helping profession possibly have a fawning response to trauma as a coping mechanism. So that also resonates with me. They all resonate with me. The problem I've had has been, where do freeze and fawn, I'm going to talk specifically about freeze though, where do they map on to the physiology in the body, right? Freeze doesn't physiologically look the same as fight or flight. Houston, we have a problem. This bothers me, right? I get it. I observe it. I see it. This is happening. This makes complete sense. But what's the physiological explanation for what's going on? I no comprendes. So I came across somebody, a researcher. Maybe you all have heard of him, and he's great, and I will link to some of his stuff and his research, Stephen Porges, who came up with the polyvagal theory. Amazing stuff. Why is this not out there more? Why am I out there looking for this kind of thing and not able to find it? But I did come across it, thankfully, because other people have linked to it, and that's how I found it. And I went, wait, I want to understand this. So Stephen Porges, he's a researcher, PhD, somewhere in the Midwest, maybe Indiana University. And he basically has, I think he's a neurophysiologist. So he looks at developmentally the nervous system, specifically the autonomic nervous system. So what I was taught in medical, what pretty much I think everybody is still taught in medical school, both conventional and naturopathic, same, would be you have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic that basically oppose one another, right? It's this two systems. So you have, and even above that, so this is part of the autonomic nervous system, meaning the part of your nervous system that is not consciously controlled. It is the trauma response. What do you do when things are bad? So, well, I should say the fight or flight is the trauma response, right? Parasympathetic is the autonomic side of also the stuff you don't have to think about, like food being digested and pooping it out, right? Rest and digest. And so all the stuff that kind of maps onto both of those, you know, I was taught this kind of model. If you have sympathetic going on with fight or flight, then parasympathetic is basically taking a back seat. And if you have parasympathetic going on, then flight or flight is taking a back seat. And the whole idea is to keep these balanced, where you go into the one you need, right? When you're in the right state. Okay, great explanation. Made sense to me. But physiologically speaking, there are still a few kinds of scenarios that are paradoxes. Because if you look at all the things that happen with sympathetic fight or flight, physiologically speaking, it's your heart speeds up, your heart starts pumping more blood to certain areas of the body, specifically the skeletal muscles so you can run, your brain so you can be alert, and your pupils dilate. You kind of shut down stuff to a lot of your organs that are about digestion, because you don't need to be necessarily digesting while you're running away from the bear. And then parasympathetic is seen as the one that kind of slows everything down. So taking your heart rate down, that's more parasympathetic tone. Vagal tone, it's often referred to. So the vagus nerve is cranial nerve 10. It is most associated with control of the parasympathetic response. The wanderer, that's literally the name of it, because when you cut into a cadaver and try to plot out where the vagus nerve is going, it goes all over the freaking place, haunting you in your dreams as a medical student while you're trying to study. And so Vegas doesn't stay in Vegas. Vegas is all over the place. It's spelled differently, guys. And so it takes things down. Well, here's the problem. We have scenarios where, again, going back to Pete Walker's book, where does freeze fit in? That doesn't really look so much like fight or flight, sympathetic. And it kind of gets lumped in. Fight or flight or freeze, right? How does that happen, physiologically speaking? We don't really know, but right? Just throw it over there. It's sort of trauma response, right? Again, observationally made sense to me. I've seen this. I've watched it in my office, but then what is it? So, Stephen Porges theory. Basically, what happens is he takes the system and says, let's turn it on its head, okay, and let's make it a hierarchical system. And so now we look at which parts developed at various times. And come to find out, he also talks about there being a third branch, if you will. So in speaking with a neonatologist, that's a doctor who basically deals with the neonate, the baby that's in utero and shortly after it's born. And when a baby is being born and it goes into fetal distress, we have this paradox, right? This is a time where there's probably the most trauma. You're about to die. And what you observe per all the people that are in the birthing world, and the neonatologist will say, is a fetus's heart rate plummets. It goes into the 20s, 30s, 40s, very low. I mean, a fetus's heart rate is actually somewhere between 110 and 150, faster than your typical adult at rest. And so dropping to the 20s, 30s, 40s is a significant drop. And it's a sign that something bad is up. Houston, we have a problem. Get the baby out. But again, where does that map onto fight or flight? Which is exactly what we'd expect if this baby is potentially going to die, and some do. Why is it the opposite of what we expect? Well, so what Stephen Porges found out is that there is a branch of the vagus nerve that is more primitive and probably, in the hierarchical scheme of things of the autonomic nervous system, the lowest form, meaning the most primitive, most earliest form that we have. And so the way the hierarchy that he sets up with the polyvagal theory would be, at the top you have that state that you're in, the parasympathetic state, for what we refer to as, which is, he renames it a little bit, the social mobilization rest and digest state, right? When you're not anxious, you're relaxed, you're going to share a meal with friends, and you're interacting socially. One step down from that would be the sympathetic, right? That is accessed when you are under fight or flight, so that you can historically run from the bear, but also maybe so you can give that presentation at work and be a bit alert and on your game, right? That's a shift into sympathetic. Your eyes dilate, your heart races a little bit, right? You're alert so that you can talk to Bobby in the back who's going to have a weird question about your presentation, right? But you're on your game. That's sympathetic on one end of the spectrum. Now, if you are in a state where you have perceived threat and you're trying to run from the bear and it doesn't work, right? The bear has caught up to you and now you are at risk of being torn limb from limb. Sorry about the violent image, but because the bear has caught you, you will drop into the most primitive form of the nervous system of the autonomic response, according to Stephen Porges' theory, which is another part of the vagus nerve associated with that, and you go into freeze. Now, why would this make complete sense? It makes complete sense because what we observe, especially in the animal kingdom, is this exact phenomenon, right? You have fight or flight as a prey. You're running from the lion that is trying to take you down. If you don't outrun the lion and you're caught in his mouth as the gazelle, then you play dead. You freeze. It's not even playing dead though, because it's an autonomic response. Your body goes limp. You probably, we know what happens from a physiological standpoint. Things slow down. You go into bradycardia, meaning your heart rate goes very slow. You dissociate. You're in a state where you're a bit more numb. And this has two benefits. Benefit number one, if you're torn limb from limb, there's a little less pain in the dying process. I'll take that option over extreme pain because I'm in fight or flight and everything is, right? That sounds actually like a good adaptive mechanism. thing number 2 is it's possible the lion abandons you, the gazelle, because it thinks you're dead and goes off to get the cubs, and in the meantime you get to escape. There's potential still that you might have a positive outcome, and you're trying to up your odds, autonomically speaking. And so this maps on to where freeze goes. So the same phenomenon, if you were under, this is why I am going to separate PTSD from complex PTSD. This is where complex PTSD comes in, because freeze, you can get stuck in the freeze response, autonomically speaking. And we can have difficulty in shifting between the various levels. We don't move so fluidly, and now things kind of get locked into place. And that's exactly what many of us observe in trauma, right? You see where, and it's not, the autonomic response really is not necessarily, it's not a choice, right? The woman who's being raped, and everybody goes, well, why didn't you run? Why did you fight back? She flipped into the freeze space, and it wasn't necessarily, it's not an option. It's just autonomically what happened. It wasn't just a perceived threat of fight or flight, it dropped further into that space. So this makes complete sense to me. Physiologically, this is what bears out. We have the part of the vagus that is basically unmyelinated, is a more primitive form. Of course, that makes sense. The myelin sheath that goes on the rest of the vagus, that's the part we think of when we think of, that is associated with parasympathetic, the common, typical parasympathetic that we've all learned. And then fight or flight. So now we just need to figure out physiologically where fawn goes. I will have the pebble out of it is now shrunk to a pebble. No longer a giant rock in my shoe. Tell me what you think. I will link to some of Stephen Porges' YouTube videos that actually have some stuff on this from Stephen Porges himself. I think his son, same last name. And he's a journalist, gave a presentation on this. Excellent, well, better described than I can possibly describe it. And so I'll link to that video, and then there's more to be found. It's great stuff. And I think, he talks about a little bit how one of the ways, the most practical ways that we actually can tonify the vagus nerve that is associated with freeze would be diaphragmatic breathing. Because that part of the vagus is below the diaphragm, and that's something consciously we can control our breathing, and shifting that, literally has effect. The physiology, the other stuff follows. So interesting to me. So thanks for tuning in. This is a little longer video, but I hope it's helpful. Like I said, I'll link, and get this theory out there, guys. It needs to be out there more, because I'm actually looking for this kind of stuff, and it wasn't easily found. But now that I know about it, it's easily found. So that's why I'm sharing it with you. Thanks for tuning in. Audio.